So let me get things started by sharing my screen. Okay, so today I want to examine the relationship between accountability and responsibility in science. And in particular, how scientific research institutions structure accountability mechanisms and the impact of those mechanisms on doing responsible science. So note that by institutions, I do not mean what sociologists and social theorists often mean by institutions, by which they talk about conventions or rules of the game, but rather I'm going to be talking about what sociologists often call formal organizations. So I'll be talking about institutions in the same way that Sandra did in introductions, as the structures and locations that really the sort of places and sort of funded research facilities and funders that structure what we do. So I'll be following the colloquial meaning of this talk. I also want to emphasize that this is new philosophical ground for me, and some of what this work has led me to argue for in this talk surprises me. So I hope you'll help me hone these ideas and challenge me on things that don't seem right, and let me know what does seem right. This discussion takes place against a backdrop of tremendous flux in how scientific communities are thinking about their responsibilities. In a recent paper that I wrote on scientific freedom and scientific responsibility, I documented in the last 20 years, we have seen a complete inversion in the sensibilities of scientific communities around societal responsibilities, and in particular for thinking about the impacts of one's research on the broader society. For the second half of the 20th century, the prevailing sensibility was that the more responsibility one had for the impacts of one's work on society, the less freedom one had, and the more freedom, the less responsibility. This is no longer the case. Starting in the 2000s, scientists began to think about freedom and responsibility in scientific practice as things that rose and fell together, that the more freedom one has, the more responsibility, and the less responsibility, the less freedom. Now, one can see this new sensibility about freedom and responsibility in the AAAS statement from 2017 on scientific freedom and responsibility, which reads, "Scientific freedom and scientific responsibility are essential to the advancement of human knowledge for the benefit of all. Scientific freedom is the freedom to engage in scientific inquiry, pursue and apply knowledge, and communicate openly. This freedom is inextricably linked to and must be exercised in accordance with scientific responsibility. Scientific responsibility is the duty to conduct and apply science with integrity, in the interests of humanity, in a spirit of stewardship for the environment, and with respect for human rights." Or consider the 2018 World Economic Forum's Young Scientist Code of Ethics. It says, "It is the responsibility of every scientist to both consider the possible consequences of their research practices, outcomes, and publications, and to undertake such research according to ethical principles. Scientists may not always have control over the findings or the end use of their research, but this does not absolve them from the responsibility to make a sincere effort to bring about positive change for society and their professional community." These statements represent an important and profound shift in how scientists think about their responsibilities. What I want to do today is think through what this shift means for institutional oversight of scientific research and the relationship between responsibilities in science and accountability mechanisms for scientists. This talk will describe both positive and negative aspects of accountability for responsible science. I will argue that not all accountability mechanisms facilitate responsible science, and this is sort of the surprise for me. Ultimately, I hope to illuminate what kinds of accountability mechanisms might, in practice, be beneficial for fostering responsible science. So first, responsibility and accountability. How are they conceptually distinct? Let's begin by describing what responsibility and accountability are in general. I think it is important to realize that they are not the same thing, and that while they should be targeted at similar issues, they function in distinct ways. So by responsibility, first of all, I mean moral responsibility, not causal responsibility. Moral responsibility is about the duties that we have and the obligations that we have. These might not be enforced by any accountability mechanism in particular. They might just be sort of our sensibilities about what our duties and our obligations are. These include both general responsibilities that we all share by virtue of being human beings in a human community, and role responsibilities that we take on because we take on particular roles like parent, teacher, or scientist. All of our responsibilities as duties and obligations include usually floors, minimum floors below which you don't want to go or you're doing something irresponsible, and ideals, striving for the best possible outcome. Scientists have responsibilities in their roles, from scientific reasoning to scientific reasoning. They have responsibilities to doing scientific reasoning properly, to the scientific community, to their colleagues and professional societies, and to the broader society in which they work. Now, what's really important about this as well, responsibility as well, is it's not bound just by what you intend. And I think the World Economic Forum statement really brings that out. It's not just what we intend, it's also what is foreseeable. So we have to think about what might happen with our actions and our choices, including what might happen beyond what we intend to have happen. Accountability is a very different sort of thing. Accountability concerns what you are asked to give an account for or what you can be held to account for. Accountability involves clear mechanisms for implementation. Someone is going to ask you to give an account or hold you to account. They are almost always focused on floors below which you don't want to fall, because that would be irresponsible. And they are usually tied to roles, that this person in this role would be accountable for something. So responsibility and accountability are kind of like morality and legality, concepts with substantial overlap, but they are not the same. Responsibility includes much beyond what accountability mechanisms can track and hold scientists accountable for. And sometimes we are accountable for impacts for which we may not even be responsible in a certain sense. For example, we may be held accountable for fraud committed by a postdoc in our lab, but we may not actually be responsible for that fraud. One of the most important differences between responsibility and accountability is that responsibility includes both concern for floors, with floors and with ideals, whereas accountability is focused just on floors. When we talk about irresponsible science, we generally mean science that falls below certain floors. For example, irresponsible science includes science that is fraudulent or that deceives human subjects about the risks they are taking by enrolling in a study, or unnecessarily inflicts suffering on animal subjects, or that fails to meet minimum biosafety requirements while working, for example, with viruses. But there are also ideals for responsible science. For example, science that benefits all of humanity or helps lift out of impoverishment some of the worst off people, or that helps prevent environmental catastrophes, or that really moves the needle on SDGs. While we might Sustainable Development Goals. While we might incentivize such ideals in science, and we should, we do not hold scientists accountable for failing to reach the ideals. Ideals are things to be striven for, knowing that we will usually fall short and that trade-offs with other goals, demands and needs, including the fact that we are mortal and that we need sleep and that we need rest, will prevent us from doing ideal work all of the time. In short, responsibilities can be very complex, with overlapping domains, synergies, and tensions. It can be very challenging to meet one's responsibilities, which is why it is good that there is space between floors and ideals, where most of us operate most of the time. That space allows us to make these sorts of trade-offs. On the other hand, accountability is aimed at making sure science is above the floors. In order to do this well, accountability mechanisms need clear floors to enforce and clear mechanisms for action, so that scientists know for what they can be held to account and for what they can be demanded to give an account. So there's a whole range of different kinds of accountability mechanisms. I'm not actually sure that I've gotten all of them here, but here are at least 4 central ones. We could have gatekeeping accountability, where you have to prove that you're meeting certain standards, minimum standards of floors to pass. For example, this is often how human and animal subject oversight works. You submit a plan for meeting the minimum standards and you get approval for your project. There's also post hoc accountability, which occurs when you failed to meet some minimum floor and someone reports you for, say, committing fraud or committing plagiarism, and then penalties will be imposed. And this is how research integrity offices often function. There's reporting accountability, where as a researcher, you just have to tell the institution or the journal editors something, for example, conflict of interest declarations. And there are process accountability, where you have to go through a process, such as a training or a checklist of things to proceed properly, and you have to show that you've met that process. So that's the reporting part. But the process itself is sort of supposed to hold you accountable in a certain way, and this is how you do biosafety protocols or animal care standards. Now, I want to emphasize that none of these are exclusive of the others, that they can be layered on top of each other. So for some domains, we might have all 4 mechanisms of accountability operating. There might be gatekeeping, post hoc, reporting, and process accountability all operating. Whereas in others, you might just have 1 or 2 operating. Now, I want to sort of emphasize that accountability mechanisms can be preventative, such as that's how gatekeeping or process accountability mechanisms, trying to keep irresponsible science from happening, or mostly punitive. So it's the post hoc accountability is sort of attempting to punish you for failing to meet some responsibility. So I hope I've made clear with this discussion a conceptual distinction between accountability and responsibility. They are not the same thing, even if the domains with which they are concerned can have substantial overlap. One additional complexity that I will try to keep track of in this discussion is who is bearing responsibility, who is being held accountable, and who is implementing accountability mechanisms. I will focus this discussion on responsibilities that individuals or research teams have and how they are held accountable or not for meeting those responsibilities. But we cannot get far into this discussion without thinking about the complexities of organizations, institutional structures, and groups of people tasked with accountability implementation. Some of these structures seem to offload responsibility, taking it away from the researcher or teams and locating it someplace else in the academic or research institution. I will argue that this is not something that accountability mechanisms should be thought to be capable of. That even with accountability mechanisms that take some decision-making away from scientists, they never take all of it, and some substantial responsibility is always left with the researcher or research team. At most, researchers might share responsibility with some accountability oversight mechanisms. Further, shared responsibility contexts can be deceiving. This can create situations where no one feels responsible and accountability is difficult to locate in practice, leading to irresponsible science. So many accountability mechanisms in science have been created to engender more responsible science. Do they? Or more precisely, when do they? And when do they impede individual responsibility? So this gets us to the next part of the talk. How are responsible science and accountability mechanisms related? Whoops. Oh, sorry, too fast. What makes for successful accountability practices or mechanisms in science? By success, I mean that they genuinely promote and facilitate responsible choices by scientists and prevent or punish irresponsible science. First, I want to argue that accountability mechanisms are neither necessary nor sufficient for responsible science. This was another surprise. Then we can ask more clearly which mechanisms will help support responsible science. So first, accountability mechanisms are not necessary for responsible science. This is because not every responsibility floor has an accountability mechanism in science. A key example of this is peer review practices. So first, let me tell you what I think the floors and ideals probably are for peer review practices, and then we'll talk about accountability mechanisms. So the floor that we should minimally when we do a peer review is, first of all, read the whole paper before writing a review. This does not always happen. Write something coherent that provides some judgment to the editor, you would hope, and don't be super late about it. Now, we know that people sometimes fall below these floors. Ideally, we would like peer reviews to read carefully the whole paper before writing their review, provide comments that will help both the editor and the author see how to proceed with the paper and how to make it better, be supportive and critical, and be on time. So that's the ideal. And we all know that we don't always make all of those ideals all of the time. So I'm skeptical that we have any accountability mechanisms for the quality of our peer reviews. Just getting like Publon credit for doing a peer review is not an accountability mechanism. We have no institutional mechanisms, mostly because masking who the peer reviewers are is crucial to getting honest feedback. There might be interpersonal accountability mechanisms because a person can get a reputation as a poor reviewer, not only among but only among editors who are the ones who see the reviews and who they are from. Given that there are no costs that I know of getting such a reputation, maybe fewer review requests. And is that actually a cost? I do not think we have any accountability mechanisms here. Is this a problem? I would suggest that this is a clear case where accountability mechanisms are not needed and would indeed impede doing responsible work. They are not needed because editors make the final call on what to share with authors, and maybe editors should be more responsible about not sharing adequate reviews, on what gets published and from whom to solicit future reviews. So the costs of a bad review can be substantially mitigated by good editorial oversight. The harms of irresponsible reviewing can be prevented by the fact that editors have final judgment. Accountability mechanisms would require the kinds of openness about who is reviewing and what reviewers are saying that could really harm the review system and poison collegial relationships in the field. It is better not to have accountability mechanisms and instead promote a culture of responsible reviewing by, for example, sharing best practices and sharing, I think, masked reviews among reviewers to help us calibrate our review work. So accountability mechanisms are not necessary for responsible practices in science. I also don't think accountability mechanisms are sufficient for responsible science. So why aren't accountability mechanisms enough? And why might they be unwise in practice for generating responsible science? First, accountability mechanisms do not support the reaching of responsibility ideals. They are not about that aspect of practice. Accountability mechanisms can then therefore compress sensibilities about responsibility back to floors and make scientists forget about pursuing ideals. And that would be a mistake if we want to promote responsible science. Second reason is if there are too many accountability mechanisms in place, scientists can come to feel that all important responsibilities are covered by such mechanisms. Because there are so many accountability mechanisms, surely there isn't anything important left out, when in fact they are not. And this might include meeting the floors. Recall that not all minimum responsibilities have accountability mechanisms. For example, we don't have minimum accountability mechanisms now for the impact of science on society, a point I'm going to get to later in the talk. If the regulatory burden of complying with accountability mechanisms is too great, senses of responsibility can disappear. And then third, accountability measures depend on there being clear floors. What happens when there are not? When we are not quite sure where the floor is, even if it seems like we have a sense that there is one. So for these three reasons, accountability mechanisms are not sufficient. This means that accountability mechanisms are neither necessary nor sufficient. So there I am being an analytic philosopher. And it is plausible that they can actually impede the conduct of responsible science. These problems with accountability mechanisms I'm going to now illustrate when I go through some examples of challenges with accountability in science. All right, so here are some things to think about. Let's think about conflict of interest disclosure. This is a reporting accountability mechanism that we have for both publications and institutions as research scientists. However, what function does it serve has been challenged by, for example, Kristen Intamin and Inma Devella Martin's 2009 paper, among others, that conflict of interest declarations don't actually prevent the sort of distortion of scientific research, nor does it sort of help us weigh in practice the import of scientific data. So it's not clear that it's actually helping to do things that it wants to do. There are also, I think the best thing that conflict of interest disclosure actually does is enable one to do a meta-analysis of the sort of relationship between having financial conflicts of interest and whether or not that sort of is always correlated with having certain results. But then there's issues of ongoing debate of what counts as a conflict of interest. First of all, what counts as a minimum amount of financial conflict? $5,000, $10,000 at my home institution. It's $5,000 that is of a financial holding that is relevant to one's research interest. So there's an additional judgment of what counts as relevant. Do previously published positions represent a conflict of interest, sort of an intellectual conflict of interest? I think that's a mistake, but I don't have time to argue for that here. There is sort of this question of, are they actually doing what they want to do? And is there, in fact, a clear floor if we have debates over what counts as a conflict of interest? Okay, another accountability mechanism that we have is human subject research oversight. This is a very important gatekeeping accountability mechanism that serves to protect human subjects from abuse. The floor that we often think about is you're supposed to protect human autonomy by making sure that there's actually informed consent practices for the research project, and that there's a good risk-benefit profile for the subjects. But there are ongoing concerns about human subject research oversight. There are concerns about informed consent and the therapeutic misconception. So it turns out putting a form in front of someone and even walking them through the understanding of, say, what counts as a double-blind randomized control trial doesn't disabuse them of the notion that the physician working them will do what's best by them, which is not what a randomized control trial does. So this still is a pervasive problem with informed consent. And so we might not even be meeting the minimum floor that we've set for ourselves. And then there are issues of what counts as exempt in the US system for IRB approval, which is the human subject oversight system that we have. You can check that your research is exempt because it does not meet the regulatory requirements for requiring IRB. Last fall at Michigan State University, a researcher performed a survey of the impact of reading hate speech on human subjects. And because it was a survey that was conducted online, he checked that it was exempt and it went out. And a lot of students who are often required to participate in studies at MSU tried to take the study and got really upset that this went through IRB approval, because IRB has approved it because the researcher checked exempt. And then it turned into this big debate over who was responsible. The researcher claimed that he was not responsible because the IRB approved it, and the IRB approved that they were not responsible because the researcher checked exempt. In the end, the researcher apologized, but it's unclear that anyone was actually held responsible or accountable. So there are problems with human subject research oversight as we have it institutionalized. Then we can think about dual use research, and select agent lists is how they're regulated in the US. So in the US, this is both a reporting and a gatekeeping mechanism, but it is triggered only if one is doing research on at least one of the pathogens or toxins on the list. So anything else outside of the select agent list is not covered, despite the fact that this is the key mechanism for accountability for dual use research. And so this sort of select agent list doesn't have on it, for example, things like horsepox, because that's not a human pathogen. And this led to, for example, the publication of how to reconstruct horsepox from mail order DNA a couple of years ago. that wouldn't fall under dual use research oversight. As sort of a recent article on dual use oversight from Lev 2019 discussed, one of the things that any dual use oversight has to handle is whether or not the risk of the research is worth it. And that's a really hard judgment to make. Okay. So every accountability mechanism that I should track a responsibility and a responsibility floor, but often they do not or do not do it well. This can be because the responsibility floor is not as bright a line as needed for the accountability mechanism. For example, what constitutes informed consent, or because of institutional drift or possible regulatory capture. So some people have accused IACUCs of not doing their job because they've become too captured by the research institution at which they're located and don't actually provide oversight of whether or not the animal suffering is worth the knowledge to be gained. Or because science has changed out from underneath the old institution. There might be new areas of fraud. For example, in the last 10 years, we've seen the opening up of the faking of peer reviews, the faking of IRB approvals, increased concerns about human tissue and data privacy. Or because existing accountability mechanisms can be utterly inadequate to ensuring floors are being met, such as, does conflict of interest really actually do anything to prevent the thing that's worried about with conflict of interest? All right, so we have problems. What should we do? So now I'm going to talk about some implications for practice. Actually, I'm taking a drink. I do not think we should just throw out accountability in science. Rather, we need to think carefully about what accountability mechanisms we need, for which floors do we need them, and how such accountability mechanisms should be structured. We need to think about the whole set of accountability mechanisms for science and the whole scope of responsibilities in science when working this out. This is the problem in front of us, and I think it's in front of us now because of the changing understanding of responsibilities for scientists that I described at the very beginning. When we look back at how the scientific research system developed, accountability mechanisms have evolved as a patchwork response. Accountability mechanisms get institutionalized when there are clear failures of minimum responsibilities, the floors. We got IRBs after the horrendous failures of Tuskegee and the pervasive failures found in Beecher's list. We got animal research oversight when revelations of how animals were being abused in research became public. We got select agent lists for research oversight after the anthrax letters were sent in 2001. Yet the patchwork of accountability mechanisms has led to a checklist mentality for responsibility, as Sabina Leonelli has also raised concerns about, as if the meeting of accountability demands meets the demands of responsibility. I've argued here that this is a significant mistake. So which responsibility floors need accountability mechanisms? And what sorts of mechanisms should we employ? Which responsibilities can be left to a culture of responsibility, or maybe a stronger culture of responsibility than we have now? First, accountability mechanisms work best when there are clear responsibility floors to be enforced, or as clear as we can manage. When we encounter problems with our floors, those should not be swept under the rug, but thoroughly and carefully discussed and addressed. It is a deep problem that informed consent protocols do not systematically attempt to correct for therapeutic misconception. At least they don't at my institution, given how pervasive the problem is and how much it undermines actual informed consent. It is a deep problem that we are not sure what level of suffering for animals is worth the promise of the knowledge to be gained in any particular study. We need to think about this problem seriously and not just assume we are doing it right with the current practices of replace, reduce, and refine. Second, we should consider whether we need an accountability mechanism at all and for a particular floor, and what kind of accountability mechanism we should use, and if it is suited to the floor that needs enforcing. I think some of the frustration with accountability mechanisms and much of the regulatory overburdening comes from inapt mechanisms. Okay, so recall the different accountability mechanisms I had at the beginning of the talk, or earlier. We have gatekeeping accountability. You have to meet a minimum floor to pass. Post hoc accountability, reporting accountability, process accountability. Now, gatekeeping mechanisms should be reserved for contexts where vulnerable populations stand at risk of immediate harm from the research process. Yet scientists should not presume that because they have passed through the gate, all responsibilities to those vulnerable populations have been met. Gatekeeping mechanisms at most share responsibility for protecting subject populations between oversight boards and researchers. They do not fully offload them. Post hoc accountability works well when standards are clear and when punishments are strong, such as public firing with public reasons. I don't think we should have confidentiality agreements around these things, or increasingly, there's been some jail time for cases of fraud in the US. Fraudulent data reporting and fraudulent ethical oversight reporting, such as faking IRB approval, are two examples of this, and it is good to see that such cases are gaining increasing attention and more potent consequences. Now, reporting accountability is not very helpful on its own. Merely reporting is much more about meeting regulatory requirements for the sake of institutional protection, and not about facilitating responsible science. When reporting triggers training, and that training is the usual rote online training, it is only marginally better. Reporting could be tied to serious reflective and deliberative opportunities, real discussions with other researchers and experts about what the reporting is for and the responsibilities involved. That might actually help. Process accountability works well when there are clear and well-known processes that will help ensure safety and ethical standards. When processes are more up in the air, with new scientific practices on the edges of breakthroughs, we will need something else. Note that with scientific research, we should generally expect things to change regarding which processes are best. How to make process accountability nimble is thus a major challenge. So in sum, accountability mechanisms are good for preventing clearly irresponsible science, gatekeeping, process accountability, or punishing clearly irresponsible science, which is what the post hoc one is about. Reporting accountability does seem to be most useful at protecting the institutions where the researchers work. Note that what is missing in these mechanisms is the fostering of deliberation, reflection, and insight, even though we know that is what is needed for responsible science. Accountability mechanisms are not good at fostering responsible science. So how could we structure research institutions so that responsibility is actually fostered? And could research institutions have practices and processes that both foster responsibility and maintain accountability? I'm going to talk through a particular case where this might be thought about, and that's particularly challenging. So I want to use these ideas to think about the difficult challenge of dual use research and societal impact of research. As I noted at the start of the talk, scientists now feel the burden of societal responsibility for the impacts of research. What kinds of responsibility fostering and accountability mechanisms might we need to ensure the responsibility to society for the impacts of one's work, including concerns about dual use research? So this is really experimental. So first, we need clear floors and a sense of ideals. The floor here has not yet been articulated to my knowledge, but I think a good candidate is that a research endeavor should not make the world foreseeably worse, or worse in a way that was foreseeable. This keeps responsibility focused on what is foreseeable and not on all things that might actually happen that no one could have foreseen, because that's too hard, and keeps responsibility properly set at more than just the intention of the researcher, which I think is where it needs to be. So this is a floor that I think no research program should fall below. Concerns about dual use research are precisely concerns about research foreseeably making the world worse. Now, ideals are obviously set higher, and ideally, a research endeavor would make the world better. I think that's what we all are trying to aim for in one way or another. So if these were the floors and ideals for the impact of research on society, what accountability mechanisms should we have? With the range of mechanisms I have described, I think it is clear that gatekeeping mechanisms would not be apt, nor would process mechanisms, nor reporting mechanisms. For gatekeeping mechanisms to apply, we would need to have them present for all research projects, not just those triggered by select agent lists, because dual use issues can show up in any scientific research project at any time unexpectedly. And we can talk more about history of how that's actually happened. Not only would this be enormously burdensome for all institutions, but it would also not work well in practice for two reasons. First, the gatekeeping mechanisms often make researchers feel like they are no longer responsible, which would be problematic because the responsibility to be alert to dual use concerns needs to be ongoing throughout the research project and not something only to think about at the start where the gate would be. So I'm skeptical of gatekeeping mechanisms for this purpose. Process mechanisms are not apt for newly arising concerns. We don't have the sort of right processes that would just catch these concerns and stop them. And reporting mechanisms are also not apt when it is not clear what we would want to have reported when, just what actually would be asking for. That leaves us with post hoc accountability mechanisms. And this seems the only plausible route of the mechanisms that I've laid out for accountability for societal impact. If a research project made the world worse, and I think it should work like cases of fraud, something that someone would need to make an accusation of after the fact, and there would need to be an institutional process about that accusation. What the punishment should be would depend on how much worse the world became and how foreseeable it was, thus gauging how reckless the researcher was. This seems to me to be a far more sensible accountability mechanism for potential dual-use research than gatekeeping, reporting, or process accountability, which all seem inapt for the issue. Now, the point of having such accountability mechanism would not be to hold scientists accountable, not to be just to hold scientists accountable for meeting minimal responsibilities. Such accountability mechanism would also be the stick to encourage responsible science. But for that, we would need practices that actually foster responsible science. So along with such an accountability mechanism, we would need to have places, clear, known places, and practices, well understood practices for scientists to reflect upon, deliberate over, and get help with meeting their responsibilities for societal impact. For example, research institutions could have a societal responsibility group or a panel, not an oversight panel, who can sit with a researcher and help with them think through the potential implications of pursuing or continuing to pursue a research project. Such partners would need to proceed with the researcher and key members of the research team in the room as part of the deliberation and discussion. It would be a place to go for help in meeting responsibilities, to help make research projects aim for the ideals while staying clear of the floors. Responsibility reflection could also be assisted with other mechanisms, such as embedded humanists, like the STIR protocol that Eric Fisher has developed, or scientific society reflective bodies that could be another place that researchers could go to deliberate over these things. It is these kinds of bodies that would assist with meeting societal responsibilities that need to be institutionalized and made a normal part of research. It is to these kinds of bodies that students with their concerns over societal impact could also turn, less to provide an impetus to investigate the researcher, but to start a conversation about the research and concerns about it. In short, a combination of post hoc accountability and genuinely supportive deliberative locations for responsibility could ensure that floors are met and might even assist reaching the ideals. With robust cultures of responsibility, post hoc accountability mechanisms will hopefully be rarely deployed. All right, in conclusion, I know, because you're all getting antsy. In sum, responsibility and accountability are not the same. We conflate them at our peril. That is because meeting all the demands of accountability does not mean one is doing responsible science. Accountability mechanisms are neither necessary nor sufficient for producing responsible science. And having too many accountability mechanisms interferes with the pursuit of responsible science. Too many accountability mechanisms can undermine the capacity in terms of attention and bandwidth to do responsible science. I've argued that we need to think through the entirety of accountability mechanisms in science, along with what should constitute responsible science in terms of floors and ideals, examining our research institutions through the lens of whether responsible science is in fact fostered. Accountability mechanisms need to be tied to clear responsibility floors and be of the kind that actually works for those floors. Accountability mechanisms also, if ever, rarely, if ever, remove or offload responsibility from the scientist. And so they should not be structured nor thought about as if they do. Accountability mechanisms should be viewed by scientists at most as a way of sharing responsibility for decisions, not offloading them. Because academic research institutions will tend, and other research institutions will tend to view such accountability mechanisms as first and foremost institutional protection mechanisms, for example, by meeting minimum regulatory requirements, it will not be easy to keep accountability mechanisms in the right frame. This will be another ongoing challenge. Finally, we should think about ways to foster deeper cultures of responsibility in science once we acknowledge the inadequacies of accountability to produce responsible science. Responsibility is cultivated in reflective conversations with colleagues and students across a range of disciplines with humility, with concern, and with care. Accountability is no substitute for this, and our efforts should go towards creating and fully embracing such a culture. It is in such a culture that responsible science will best thrive. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the Q&A.